A heartbroken widower was gifted a woman, shattered and still, a cruel jest in a town that had forgotten mercy, until he saw the unbroken spirit in eyes that could not look away. The dust of Redemption Gulch, a town clinging to the scorched hem of the territories, swirled with a particular malevolence that afternoon, mirroring the grit in men's souls. Ilara lay on a crude wooden pallet, thrown onto the splintered boardwalk before the saloon like a sack of unwanted grain. Her body, from the waist down, was a prisoner of stillness, a consequence of a runaway wagon and a ravine that had claimed her movement but not her life. Above her, Jedediah Scorn, a man whose laughter was as coarse as his beard, bellowed, fresh off the trail, "Boys! A bit of a broken filly, this one, but Silas Blackwood yonder needs some company, don't Silas? Something to keep his cold bed warm, even if she can't dance a jig." A wave of guttural amusement rippled through the onlookers, a gallery of hardened faces, each etched with the frontee's cruelties. Ilara stared at the warped wooden planks above her head, the jeers washing over her like another layer of dust, another indignity in a life that had become a ledger of them. She didn't cry. Tears were a currency she'd learned was worthless. Her hands, calloused and small, clenched at her sides, the only rebellion she could muster. The town saw a broken woman, a burden, a whispered judgment of cursed or unlucky. They saw the dirt on her cheek, the rip in her threadbare dress, the unnerving stillness of her legs, and they recoiled, their fear masked as contempt. She was an object, a piece of unfortunate property to be bartered or discarded. The scent of stale beer and unwashed bodies assaulted her, a suffocating blanket. Each snicker, each pointed finger, was a fresh nail hammered into the coffin of her hope. She had been passed along, from one uncaring hand to another, ever since the accident had stolen her leg's betrayal, and with them, her perceived worth. Redemption Gulch was just another station on her Calvary, its inhabitants eager to cast their stones. She braced herself for the inevitable next move, the rough hands that would haul her, the dismissive grunt that would seal her fate, at least for a while longer, in this pitiless world. The sun beat down, merciless, and the shadows of the jeering crowd lengthened, trapping her in their cage. Silas Blackwood, a man carved from the granite of grief and solitude, stood at the edge of the small crowd, his face a mask of weary endurance. His limp, a bitter memento from a war he'd tried to forget, ached with the changing weather and the weight of too many years alone on his ranch, aptly named Solitude's End. He'd come to town for salt and nails, not for a spectacle of human cruelty. Jedediah Scorn's voice, loud and abrasive, grated on his already frayed nerves. He saw the woman on the pallet, the unnatural stillness of her lower body, the way her gaze was fixed, not in vacancy, but in a kind of defiant endurance that pricked at something deep within his chest, something he thought long dead. The town's laughter was a familiar sound, the baying of a pack that had scented vulnerability. He'd been on the receiving end of their pity, their whispers, after Martha was gone. His own sorrow was a constant companion, a shadow that stretched long even at noon. He had no room for another's pain, his own was a vast enough burden. Yet, the sight of her, so utterly exposed, so publicly degraded, stirred a protective instinct he hadn't felt in years. It was the same instinct that made him mend a broken bird's wing, or sit up all night with a sick calf. Scorn swaggered, enjoying his moment. "What say you, Blackwood? Free of charge. Just take her off my hands. A gift, from me to you." More laughter, sharper this time, aimed at Silas as much as the woman. Silas's jaw tightened. He looked at Ilara again. Her eyes, dark and fathomless, met his for a fleeting second. He saw not emptiness, but a banked fire, a spirit refusing to be extinguished. He thought of Martha's gentleness, of the kindness that had once been the bedrock of his life. What would she have done? The answer was immediate and shaming. He took a slow, deliberate step forward, the crowd parting slightly, their amusement faltering at his approach. He ignored Scorn, his gaze fixed on Ilara. His voice, when it came, was rough from disuse, like stones grinding together. Enough just one word, but it fell into the sudden silence with the weight of an anvil. Scorn blinked, his bravado wavering. "Now, Silas, just a bit of fun." Silas reached into his worn pocket and pulled out a single silver dollar, tarnished and smooth. He didn't offer it to Scorn. Instead, he placed it gently on the pallet beside Ilara's hand. "She's not for sale," he stated, his voice low but carrying an undeniable authority. "And she's not a gift for your amusement." He then looked directly at Scorn, his eyes like chips of winter ice. "Get your cart. I'll take her." There was no negotiation, no discussion. Just a quiet finality that brooked no argument. The crowd, sensing a shift they didn't quite understand, grew quiet, their earlier mockery dissolving into uneasy curiosity. Silas Blackwood, the grieving recluse, had just claimed the broken woman. The journey to Solitude's End was made in a silence broken only by the creak of Silas's old buckboard and the sigh of the wind through the sparse pines. Ilara lay on a bed of hay he'd hastily arranged, her body jarring with every rut in the poorly maintained track. She watched him, his broad back, the set of his shoulders, the way his hands, calloused and strong, held the reins with a steady competence. Fear was a cold knot in her stomach. She'd been taken before, and it had never ended well. This man, Silas, was different from Scorn, quieter, his sorrow a palpable aura around him, but he was still a man, and she was still helpless. What did he want from her? The question echoed in the barren landscape of her mind. His ranch was a testament to his name, isolated, weathered, the main cabin clinging to a slight rise as if bracing against the vast, indifferent sky. A few chickens scratched in the dust, and a lean hound lifted its head from the porch, thumping its tail once in greeting before settling back down. Silas gently lifted her from the buckboard, his touch surprisingly careful, his arms strong. He carried her inside, the dim interior smelling of wood smoke, old leather, and a faint, lingering scent of dried lavender she couldn't place. He laid her on a narrow cot in the main room, near the stone fireplace. "Rest," he said, the word blunt but not unkind. He didn't linger, didn't stare. He moved about the small cabin, tending to chores, his limp more pronounced after the journey. He brought her a bowl of thin broth and a piece of bread. She ate slowly, her eyes never leaving him, cataloguing his movements, searching for any sign of threat. Days bled into one another. Silas spoke little. He'd ask, hungry, or need water, and provide what was necessary. He mended a loose shutter that banged in the night wind near her cot. He placed a battered wooden crate beside her, so she could keep her few belongings, a comb, a small, smooth stone she'd carried for years, within reach. She, in turn, tried to make herself as small, as unobtrusive as possible. She kept her space tidy, folding the thin blanket meticulously each morning. She listened to the sounds of the ranch, the distant lowing of cattle, the chop of his axe, the mournful cry of a hawk. She learned the rhythm of his solitude, the deep sighs that escaped him when he thought she wasn't listening. He never touched her unnecessarily, never demanded anything. He simply existed alongside her, a quiet, brooding presence that was slowly, almost imperceptibly, becoming less terrifying and more of a predictable, stable feature in her upended world. One afternoon, he came in from the fields, his face grimier than usual, and without a word, placed a small, wilting wildflower, a stubborn splash of purple gleaned from the arid land, in an empty tin cup on the crate beside her. It was a tiny gesture, easily missed, but for Ilara, it was the first crack of light in a long, dark winter. The nights were the hardest. In the flickering firelight, with the vast, empty silence of the plains pressing in, the ghosts of their pasts danced in the shadows. Silas would sit by the hearth, cleaning a rifle or mending tack, the rhythmic scrape and pull a counterpoint to the wind's mournful song. Ilara, lying on her cot, would watch the flames, her own memories replaying like a cruel, unending show. One evening, the air was heavy, pregnant with an unspoken tension. A storm was brewing outside, the wind rattling the cabin's ill-fitting windows, mirroring the turmoil within. Silas had been quieter than usual, his brow furrowed deeper. He finally broke the silence, his voice raspy. "My wife, Martha, she loved storms. Said they cleaned the air." Ilara waited, sensing this was more than just a comment on the weather. He stared into the fire, his hands clenching and unclenching. "It was a fever. Took her fast. Doctor said there was nothing to be done. This place, it was her dream. Now it's just quiet." He didn't look at her, but the admission hung in the air, raw and exposed. The story of his deep, abiding grief, the source of his haunted eyes and the permanent slump of his shoulders, was laid bare. Ilara felt a pang of something akin to understanding. Loss was a language she knew intimately. Hesitantly, her own voice barely a whisper, she found herself speaking. "The wagon, it was my pa driving. He'd been drinking, the words were like pulling teeth, rusty and painful. He swerved to miss a deer. Or so they said. I don't remember much. Just falling. And then the quiet. When I woke up, my legs, they wouldn't listen to me anymore." She paused, the memory still sharp, still capable of stealing her breath. "Pa left soon after. Couldn't stand the sight of me," he said. "My aunt took me in for a while. Then her husband, he said I was too much trouble." She didn't elaborate on the nature of that trouble. She didn't need to. The shadows in her eyes spoke volumes. Silas turned then, his gaze meeting hers, and for the first time, she saw not pity, but a shared sorrow, a recognition of pain. He nodded slowly. "Some folks can't bear what's broken," he said, his voice softer than she'd ever heard it. "They see weakness. They don't see the fight it takes to just keep breathing." In that shared moment, by the dying fire, with the storm raging outside, a fragile bridge of understanding was built between them. Two souls, shipwrecked by life, had found a momentary harbor in each other's confessed pain. The silence that followed was different, no longer empty, but filled with the unspoken acknowledgement of their respective burdens. The fire crackled, casting dancing shadows that seemed a little less menacing now. The autumn deepened, painting the sparse foliage in hues of rust and gold, but it brought with it an early, vicious blizzard that swept down from the northern mountains without warning. Silas had been out since dawn, checking the fences along the north pasture, miles from the cabin, expecting nothing more than a cold snap. The snow began as a gentle flurry, then quickly intensified into a blinding white maelstrom, the wind howling like a banshee, erasing the world. Ilara, from her cot, watched the snow pile against the window panes, a growing dread tightening her chest. Silas was strong, capable, but this storm was a monster. Hours passed. The light outside faded into an eerie gray, and the cabin grew cold despite the fire she struggled to maintain, her limited reach making it a difficult task. She strained her ears, listening for any sound of his return, but heard only the roar of the wind. Panic began to set in. He should have been back by now. Then she remembered. The old barn, the one Silas said had a weak north wall. He'd been meaning to fix it. He'd mentioned it almost in passing, how a strong northerly gale could bring it down. And he'd taken the skittish new mare, Bess, with him, the one easily spooked. Her mind, sharpened by immobility and a lifetime of acute observation, raced. If he was caught out, if the mare panicked, if that wall collapsed. She had to do something. But what? She was trapped, a prisoner in her own body. Then her gaze fell upon Silas's old signal mirror, hanging by a leather thong on the wall, something he used for hunting or if he got into trouble far out on the range. It was out of her reach. But next to it, on a low shelf, was his long branding iron. With a grunt of effort, her heart pounding, Ilara stretched, her fingers straining, just managing to knock the heavy iron to the floor with a clatter. Pain shot through her shoulder, but she ignored it. Using the poker from the fireplace, painstakingly, awkwardly, she managed to hook the branding iron and drag it closer. Then, with movements that were a torment of effort and frustration, she used the hooked end of the poker to try and snag the leather thong of the mirror. Again and again she tried, her arms aching, her breath coming in ragged gasps. Finally, with a small sob of triumph, the mirror clattered down beside her. Her hand shook as she picked it up. The storm was a white wall outside, but occasionally, the wind would shift, creating momentary, swirling clearings. She knew the general direction of the north pasture. Angling the mirror, she caught the faint, diffused light from the window, hoping against hope that even in this gloom, a flash might be seen, a desperate signal against the terrifying white. She didn't know if it would work, if anyone could possibly see it, but she had to try. She was not just a burden. She would fight for him, the only way she knew how. Hours later, as the storm finally began to abate, a faint, desperate shout reached the cabin. Ilara, slumped against her cot, exhausted but still clutching the mirror, strained to hear. It came again, weaker this time. Silas. He was alive. But the sound was close, too close to the ravine that cut through the west side of their property. She yelled his name until her throat was raw, but her voice was swallowed by the wind. She knew he couldn't have seen her faint flashes of light, the snow had been too thick. Her desperate signaling had been for naught. Yet, something had guided him, or perhaps sheer grit alone. She then heard a scraping, a dragging sound, and then his figure appeared at the door, covered in snow, his face grey with exhaustion and pain. He collapsed just inside, his leg bent at an unnatural angle. Bess, spooked, fell, he gasped, his breath misting in the frigid air. Legs broken, I think. North wall of the old barn came down, lucky to get out. Ilara's heart clenched. He was hurt, badly. The nearest doctor was a day's ride away, impossible in this snow. She pointed towards the fireplace, then towards the kettle. Water, she mouthed, her voice hoarse. Splint, he nodded, understanding. With agonizing slowness, he dragged himself towards the hearth. Ilara, her mind racing, directed him. Blankets, under my cot. And the whiskey, in the cupboard. She talked him through it, her voice surprisingly steady, drawing on a well of forgotten knowledge from her mother, who had been a healer of sorts. How to clean the wound, how to check for broken skin, how to find straight pieces of wood for a makeshift splint. He gritted his teeth against the pain as he worked, following her instructions. She, in turn, offered words of encouragement, her presence a focal point in his agony. It was a torturous process. He, weakened and in excruciating pain, she, immobile but fiercely determined. Together, they fashioned a crude splint, his groans of pain tearing at her. She made him drink some of the whiskey, then guided him as he packed snow around the injured leg to numb it. For days, she was his eyes and hands, reminding him when to eat the meager rations, ensuring the fire didn't die, talking to him when the fever from his injury made him delirious, her calm voice a lifeline in the disorienting fog of pain. He, in turn, relied on her completely, his usual stoicism shattered by his helplessness. In that snowbound cabin, surrounded by a world reduced to white and grey, their roles were reversed. He, the strong protector, was now the vulnerable one. And she, that had broken a woman, found a profound strength in caring for him, her spirit rising to meet the challenge, proving that her worth was not measured by the steps she couldn't take, but by the resilience of her heart. As the last of the snow melted and a fragile spring breathed life back into the land, Silas's leg began to mend, though his limp was now more pronounced. The quiet rhythm of their life resumed, but something fundamental had shifted between them. The shared crucible of the blizzard had forged a new intimacy, a reliance that went deeper than words. Ilara found herself sketching in a discarded ledger Silas had given her, using a piece of charcoal from the fire. She drew the wildflowers he sometimes still brought, the way the light fell across the cabin floor, the hawk that circled overhead. It was a way to speak, to capture the world she observed with such intensity. Silas would watch her sometimes, a softness in his gaze that hadn't been there before. He started talking more, not just about the ranch, but about his boyhood, about Martha's favorite songs, small pieces of himself offered up like precious gifts. But their fragile peace was not to last. One sun-drenched afternoon, a shadow fell across the doorway. Jedediah Scorn stood there, a leering grin splitting his face, two rough-looking men flanking him. Well, Blackwood. Heard you survived the winter. And looky here, the little broken bird is still chirping. His eyes roved over Ilara, a predatory gleam in them. Heard you might have come into some luck, Blackwood. That mine up north showing some color again. And I reckon my gift to you has earned me a share of that luck. Or maybe, he added, his voice turning uglier, I just decided I want her back. A man gets lonely. Silas rose slowly, placing himself between Scorn and Ilara. His hand instinctively went to the axe handle leaning near the door, but he hesitated. The thought of violence, the visceral memory of war, of blood and death, made his stomach churn. He'd sworn off it, that brutal part of himself. She's not yours to take, Scorn, Silas said, his voice dangerously low. She's not property, Scorn laughed, a harsh, barking sound. Everything's property, Blackwood, if you're strong enough to take it. And you don't look so strong anymore, old man. One of Scorn's men took a step forward. Ilara's heart hammered. She saw the conflict in Silas's eyes, the deep-seated aversion to what was coming, warring with his protective instinct. She knew he was remembering another fight, another loss. This was not just about her, it was about him confronting the ghosts that had haunted him for years. If he didn't fight now, not just for her, but for the life they were tentatively building, Scorn would destroy everything. The tension in the small cabin was thick enough to cut with a knife. Scorn's men fanned out slightly, their expressions predatory. Last chance, Blackwood, Scorn sneered. Hand her over, and we might just walk away without breaking more than your spirit. Silas's gaze flickered to Ilara. He saw not fear in her eyes, though he knew it must be there, but a quiet, unwavering belief in him. It was the same look she'd had during the blizzard, when his life had depended on her steadfastness. That look, more than any threat from Scorn, galvanized him. The reluctance, the old trauma, receded, replaced by a cold, hard resolve. He would not let this man, this embodiment of the world's casual cruelty, touch her or defile the sanctuary they had found. He let go of the axe. Violence wasn't always about the biggest weapon. Sometimes it was about resolve. You'll leave, Silas said, his voice flat, devoid of emotion but radiating an intensity that gave even Scorn pause. Now Scorn, misinterpreting Silas's lack of immediate aggression as weakness, gestured to his men. Take her. As the first man lunged, Silas moved with a speed that belied his limp. It wasn't the wild flailing of a desperate man, but the precise, economical movement of someone who knew how to fight, who had perhaps known it too well. He sidestepped the clumsy attack, using the man's momentum against him, sending him crashing into the rough-hewn table. Before the second man could react, Silas delivered a single, brutal punch to his jaw, laying him out cold. Scorn, momentarily stunned, snarled and drew a wicked-looking knife. You always were a stubborn fool, Blackwood. He lunged, aiming for Silas's gut. Ilara screamed, a raw, primal sound. At that moment, the hound, Old Blue, who had been lying seemingly asleep by the hearth, launched himself with a furious growl, sinking his teeth into Scorn's knife arm. Scorn howled in pain and surprise, dropping the weapon. Silas didn't hesitate. He disarmed Scorn with a swift, disabling blow, then hauled the whimpering bully to his feet. Get out, Silas growled, his face inches from Scorn's, his eyes blazing with a righteous fury. And if you ever come near this ranch, or her, again, the ground will drink your blood. He shoved Scorn towards the door, where his first man was groggily picking himself up. The second remained unconscious. Silas watched, his chest heaving, as Scorn and his dazed accomplice stumbled away, dragging their fallen comrade with them, their threats turning into panicked whimpers as they fled. When they were gone, an unnerving silence descended, broken only by Silas's harsh breathing and Old Blue's contented lickings of Ilara's outstretched hand. Silas turned slowly, his gaze finding Ilara's. The fury drained from him, leaving behind a profound weariness, but also a new clarity. He had faced his demons, and he had protected what was precious. In the aftermath of the confrontation, the silence in the cabin was charged, not with fear, but with the raw, undeniable truth of what had passed between them. Silas walked over to Ilara, his limp more pronounced, his knuckles bruised. He knelt beside her cot, his gaze searching hers. The violence had stripped away the last vestiges of their guardedness. All that was left was vulnerability and a fierce, unspoken tenderness. He reached out a calloused hand, not to touch her, but to gently pick up a small, intricately carved wooden bird that had fallen from the crate beside her during the commotion, a whittling project he'd been working on for weeks, a secret gift he hadn't known how to give. He turned it over in his palm, the wood smooth and warm. It was a meadowlark, its head tilted as if in midsong, its tiny form full of life. He looked from the bird to her, his throat tight. Words had always failed him when it mattered most. Martha, he began, his voice hoarse, then stopped. This wasn't about Martha, not anymore. This was about Ilara. This ranch, he said, his gaze sweeping the small, humble room, it was just a place to wait for the end. Empty. Like me, he looked back at her, his eyes, usually so guarded, now open and filled with an emotion that made her heart ache. You brought it back to life, Ilara. You brought me back." He hesitated, then gently placed the small wooden meadowlark in her hand, closing her fingers around it. "This ain't much," he mumbled, his usual gruffness softened by an uncharacteristic earnestness. "But it's yours. Like this place is yours. If you choose it." "I'm not keeping you, Ilara," his voice cracked slightly. "I'm choosing you. Every day, I choose you." Tears welled in Ilara's eyes, the first she had allowed herself to shed in his presence, not tears of sorrow or fear, but of an overwhelming, unexpected joy. She couldn't speak, her emotions too immense for words. She simply tightened her fingers around the carved bird, its delicate shape a promise of flight, of freedom, of belonging. She reached out her other hand, hesitantly, and laid it on his arm. It was a small touch, but it conveyed everything. Acceptance. Reciprocation. A shared future. He covered her hand with his own, his large, rough palm encompassing hers, a silent vow passing between them in the quiet sanctuary of their reclaimed home. The threat was gone, the past confronted. What lay before them was uncertain, but they would face it together, two broken souls mending each other, piece by precious piece. A year later, the ranch known as Solitude's End was no more. In its place stood Meadowlark Rise, a name Ilara had whispered one evening, inspired by the song of the birds that now seemed to fill every corner of their land, and by the small wooden token that never left her side. The cabin, once dark and leaning, now boasted a sturdy porch Silas had built, wide enough for the wheeled chair he had painstakingly constructed for Ilara. It wasn't a cure, her legs were still unwilling, but it was freedom of a different kind. She could move around the cabin, out onto the porch, even into the small garden she now tended with fierce devotion. Bright splashes of wildflowers, transplanted from the plains, bloomed defiantly against the weathered wood, a testament to her resilient spirit. Silas, his limp still present but his shoulders straighter, his eyes clear and often crinkling with a quiet smile, worked the land with a renewed vigor. The fields were more productive, the small herd healthier. But the biggest change was in the air itself. It hummed with a quiet joy, a contentment that radiated outwards. The people of Redemption Gulch, initially skeptical, then grudgingly curious, had slowly come to see Ilara not as the broken woman or Silas's burden, but as a person of quiet strength and surprising wisdom. Doc Miller had been the first to truly see it, after Ilara, recalling her mother's herbal remedies, had suggested a poultice for a stubborn infection that had baffled him, a remedy that worked. Then young Timmy Evans had gotten lost in the foothills, and Ilara, with her uncanny ability to notice the smallest details Silas had mentioned about the terrain and her intuitive understanding of how a frightened child might think, had helped direct the search party, her calm insights proving crucial. Slowly, the whispers had changed from pity and suspicion to respect, and even admiration. Women from the town would sometimes ride out, ostensibly to buy Ilara surprisingly potent dried herbs or her intricately stitched quilt squares, but mostly, it seemed, just to sit with her on the porch, to bask in her serene presence, to share their troubles and find a listening, understanding ear. Silas would watch them, a quiet pride swelling in his chest. She was not a thing to be tamed or fixed, but a spirit to be cherished. She had not just changed his life, she had given him a new one, filled with purpose, with laughter, and with a love deeper and more profound than he had ever thought possible. Meadowlark Rise wasn't just a ranch, it was a testament to hope, a sanctuary built on the foundations of shared sorrow and unwavering devotion. The world may cast its stones, may label and discard those it deems imperfect or burdensome, but the enduring strength of the human spirit, when met with the gentle hand of kindness and unwavering acceptance, can indeed bloom in the most barren of lands, transforming desolation into a garden of profound beauty. Ilara, once a paralyzed woman gifted as a cruel jest, a symbol of brokenness in a harsh and unforgiving world, became the giver of unforeseen hope, her stillness a deep well of wisdom and resilience from which an entire community began to draw strength. Silas, a widower hollowed by grief and retreating from the world, found his fractured heart not just mended, but expanded, refilled with a love that was quiet yet powerful enough to rebuild his life and rename his despair into a place of sunrise. Their story, etched into the dusty plains and whispered on the prairie wind, serves as a poignant reminder that true worth is not measured by physical ability or societal expectation, but by the courage to see beyond the surface, the capacity for compassion, and the brave choice to build a shared sanctuary where two souls, however damaged, can find healing and wholeness together. He didn't just receive a broken woman, he received the key to unlocking his own buried heart, and in turn, gave her the safety to let her own spirit soar free, unburdened by the world's cruel judgments. If their journey of resilience, love, and mutual redemption has touched your heart and rekindled your belief in the transformative power of compassion, please show your support by liking this video, sharing their inspirational story with others who might need to hear it, and subscribing to our channel for more tales that illuminate the enduring strength of the human heart and prove that love, in its purest form, can truly mend any wound and change any life.